Welcome to Buzz House, a Baker Tilly podcast where you can hear all the buzz around multifamily housing, with all the info you need to help you win now and anticipate tomorrow. Hi, I'm Don Bernards, the principal in charge of Baker Tilly's multifamily housing practice.
And I'm Garrett Gibson, a principal at Baker Tilly, also specializing in consulting on multifamily housing transactions across the country.
Let's get started. Today, our guest in the Buzz House is someone many of our listeners are familiar with, is such an asset to our industry, and we're very excited to have on today. Of course, I'm talking about Stockton Williams. Stockton, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Very good. Stockton, of course, is the executive director of the National Council of State Housing Agencies. Stockton has held senior leadership positions in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors throughout a career dedicated to expanding housing opportunity. NCSHA is a national nonprofit, nonpartisan organization created by the nation's state housing finance agencies to advance through advocacy and education their efforts to provide affordable housing to those who need it. We'll be talking with Stockton today about some of the current priorities and activities of NCSHA and other current housing issues. Now, Garrick and I are very excited to jump into our discussion with Stockton. Go ahead, Garrick.
Thanks, Don, and thanks for being on Buzzhouse, Stockton. So before we jump in with some questions, why don't you give our listeners some insight into your background and work with NCSHA?
I started my career as a developer of affordable housing in and around my hometown of Baltimore, Maryland. And after doing that for several years, found my way to Washington, D.C., where I worked for NCSHA from 1995 to 2000. From 2000 until 2018, I had several jobs in the city, typical of a lot of people. I had the opportunity to serve in the federal government. I did some consulting. I worked for a think tank and a national nonprofit housing organization. In 2018, I was honored to be selected as executive director of NCSHA, and it has just been an incredibly exciting, at times tumultuous period for affordable housing finance in general and for housing finance agencies in particular. So we've been incredibly busy and active, and don't expect 2026 will be any different.
You're probably right about that. So, Stockton, with that, we'll just go ahead and jump in with a few questions around 2026 goals of NCSHA. One of the goals stated is to increase and improve America's housing supply. So there looks to be many items in the Road to Housing Act of 2025, which look to reduce regulatory barriers and costs. Have you seen progress on this actual goal, and what is NCSHA working with regard to this goal?
Well, just last week, NCSHA's board of directors met, and as they always do at their December meeting, passed the organization's priorities for 2026. And NCSHA, like I suspect most organizations of the folks listening to this podcast, has prioritized efforts to increase the supply of affordable homes and rental apartments really for the last several years, because we know the lack of supply really is at the root of the housing affordability challenge that the country faces. The Road to Housing Act, which you mentioned, is a piece of legislation that has been working its way through the Senate for the last couple of years. This summer, it passed the Senate Banking Committee with a resounding bipartisan vote, which was surprising and fantastic. And then things got even better when the full Senate included the measure in a defense policy bill that it passed. So the Road to Housing, as most of your listeners probably know, is a comprehensive housing bill that includes dozens of provisions related to housing supply, housing regulations, housing programs. NCSHA is very excited about a number of provisions in the bill. And the next step, of course, is for companion legislation to pass the House. A similar bill, in fact, called the 21st Century Housing Act, passed the House Financial Services Committee 50-1. That's not a typo or a misprint, 50-1 yesterday. And while that is not going to make it all the way through the House of Representatives this year, the fact that the Senate has passed a comprehensive bill, the House Financial Services Committee has done the same, definitely sets things up for major housing legislation to pass and get signed into law in 2026. It'd be the first time in a number of years a bill of this scope would be signed into law. So NCSHA is working very hard with members of both parties in the House and Senate to compromise and find common ground on the parts of these two bills that differ, to pick from each one the provisions that we think would be most helpful in expanding supply in particular. And we're very optimistic that something really significant for affordable housing will pass through Congress at some point in 2026.
Perfect. Thank you for that update. Very exciting, as you noted. Stockton, kind of staying on priorities and other current actions, another one of NCSHA's stated priorities to ensure the continued quality and affordability of affordable housing. We know there is a lot of action steps around the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, AHCAA, very big additions and accomplishments, the 12%, more 9% credits, obviously the 50% test to 25%. There's also a lot of language around, opportunity zones. So maybe a couple questions. Are there priorities on your agenda, on the housing agenda, if you will, around AHCAA, things that maybe didn't make it? And then is there anything going on with opportunity zones and workforce housing?
Well, I mentioned the first priority was and is to increase the supply. The other side of that coin, as every houser knows, is of course, we've got to preserve and continue to maintain the existing stock of affordable housing. So that's part of what we mean by maintaining affordability. And then on the homeownership side, as well as for rental apartment construction, we need to always be driving down the cost of financing, the cost of development. So that affordability agenda is the complement to the focus on adding supply. Now, in terms of the two areas you mentioned specifically, Don, the terrific and historic expansion of the housing credit program in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act will actually help housing finance agencies and their partners in the private sector do both. It will provide, through expansion of credit and lower bond financing test, the resources to build more affordable apartments and to preserve and rehabilitate existing properties. So that policy is going to be a game changer. States around the country are working hard to revise their rules and procedures that accompany the allocation of low-income housing tax credits and looking at how they can really optimize this new law. I think it will absolutely spur both additional construction in 2026 compared to what otherwise had been the case, as well as a lot of investment and recapitalization of older existing affordable housing. Of course, both are important. The low-income housing tax credit, as your listeners are well aware, has a long track record as a proven, effective program that really delivers and preserves affordable housing for low-income renters. Opportunity zones, which are newer, of course, have been shown to be an effective incentive for the creation of more middle-income and market rate affordable housing. And even though for housing finance agencies, that is not as primary area of focus, although it is something more housing finance agencies are getting involved in, everyone in affordable finance, housing finance, recognizes or should the benefits of expanding housing supply generally. And so while you can't say opportunity zones are an affordable housing incentive or are generating development of very low income targeted units, you can say, and the evidence is pretty strong, that it has spurred construction development of a lot of other housing that is beneficial in communities. And so I do expect housing finance agencies that are starting to launch programs targeting mixed and middle income housing, which is a real trend around the country, will be very interested in linking their financing incentives to projects and activity and opportunity zones. I also think you're going to see the Trump administration through HUD and USDA and Treasury really try to encourage and push state and local jurisdictions to allocate federal funds, block grants, and so on into opportunity zones in 2026. So there's no question the Trump administration really believes strongly in opportunity zones. It will be one of their signature housing and community development policies. And so it's going to be critical for everyone in our business to find ways to utilize and benefit from that incentive.
Perfect. Stockton, thanks for those insights. And back to middle income, we had Colorado Housing on talking about the middle income housing tax credit. So definitely, as you said, kind of a trend. So
Right.
Stockton, staying on legislation, we talked about the Road to Housing Act and very comprehensive. You know, that also out there's the Home Reform Act. Where does that kind of stand? And what are you seeing? Is that a provision NCSHA is focused on?
Yeah, absolutely. In most states, the home housing block grant is administered at the state level by the Housing Finance Agency. Home is really a Swiss Army knife, as we call it, for housing. It can do just about anything and plays a critical role in gap filling the pro formas, the capital stack for affordable multifamily transactions involving low income housing tax credits. So, home is just an incredibly important program. It's been around almost as long as the low income housing tax credit. And while the credit has evolved considerably through IRS regulatory guidance, home really has remained pretty static. The regulations and the implementing administrative guidance hasn't really evolved as much. And some of that's just because the home statute's pretty darn prescriptive. There's only so much a HUD under any administration can really do. So in the House of Representatives, Representative Flood and Representative Cleaver, who are the top Republican and Democrat respectively, on the House Housing Subcommittee, part of the Financial Services Committee, have really been working hard almost all year, really, since the very beginning of the year, to dig into the home program legislation and make all kinds of important, frankly, overdue improvements that'll make it a much more efficient program for state and local jurisdictions to administer, and equally important, the private sector and nonprofit organizations to use. So the Home Reform Act is absolutely in the mix as Congress is considering these broader housing bills that I mentioned, the Road to Housing Act in the Senate and the 21st Century Housing Act in the House. And we're optimistic that significant home reforms will be passed as part of more comprehensive housing legislation in 2026.
Well, that's comforting news, Stockton. Let's shift gears a little bit and like to discuss maybe what you guys are working on. So, specifically regarding state housing finance agencies, are there any best practices, any new news, or any work that NCSHA is currently working on?
Well, I really appreciate the question because an incredibly important part of the value proposition for the state housing finance agencies that created our organization is to share what is working across states and to develop what become recommended practices in all aspects of their administration, their role in running federal housing programs, and also utilizing their own resources. So NCSHA is constantly, through our conferences, online learning, other efforts, helping agencies learn from each other and build towards common recommended or best practices. We've done that extensively over the years in the case of the low-income housing tax credit, and those have really become adopted industry-wide and are available for anyone who's interested on our website. But in some of the other areas that are particularly exciting, where we see new and emerging areas of practice and innovation in housing finance, include two that I'd mentioned. One, which we've touched on already, states around the country, Colorado, Michigan, New York, a number of others have started to develop and roll out mixed and middle income housing incentive programs. So sources of new funding to support the development and the construction of affordable apartments serving people who earn too much to qualify for low-income housing tax credit finance housing. A number of other states we know are actively developing these programs. I think in 2026, we will see them start to sprout all over the country. And it's an incredibly exciting part of what housing finance agencies are really leading on. And in that work, they're all looking closely at what some of the early pioneers, the first states to stand these up, are doing. Another area that I just mentioned quickly on this podcast is on the single family side. Upwards of 20 state housing finance agencies now have launched or soon will start new financing programs to spur single family starter home construction, which of course is a critical part of the housing supply shortage and really deeply related to the incredibly high rents and upward pressure on rents in the multifamily area because there's just not enough starter homes. The private sector has a very, very hard time building them. Fewer than 10% of new home starts now are what you would consider a starter or entry-level home. So housing finance agencies, again, kind of stepping in here, creating new tools, new resources to try to meet that need in the market. And it is another area where we're developing and sharing what agencies are doing and coming up with recommended practices.
Yeah, thanks for that. And what about looking ahead? So, over the next couple of years, Stockton, what do you see as priorities for NCSHA that will need to be addressed?
Well, I'm always hopeful, and I remain hopeful that we'll continue to make progress and maybe even have one of the better years in recent memory in terms of congressional activity addressing housing supply and affordability, those two pillars of our priorities that we've been talking about. But even if we do, we know that the needs to catch up on our huge housing supply deficit and to drive down the costs and make housing of all kinds, rental and owner occupied, more affordable, are both multi-year efforts. So it's safe to say we will be at that, and those two issues will be top priorities for us for the foreseeable future. I would say with respect to development costs in particular, for lots of reasons, really I think dating back to COVID and the inflation and interest rate spike that came out of it, we know that it's harder, it's more expensive for private sector and community organizations involved in housing to deliver projects. And so housing finance agencies have really taken it upon themselves and will be working very intensively through NCSHA to find ways to drive down the costs of developing and constructing affordable apartments. And that's going to be a major area of multi-year focus. And the cost of capital, whether it's for a first-time homebuyer mortgage loan or debt for an apartment project, is just such a critical issue. Housing finance agencies were really created to provide lower cost capital for both of those purposes in the 60s and 70s. And through various mechanisms and their incredible creativity and resilience, they have been able to do that through all kinds of market cycles and economic environments. These last several years, as your listeners are well familiar with the rise in interest rates and inflation, have been really challenging for all aspects of affordable housing finance. So the other big area that I think will be a multi-year focus is on creating new tools, new mechanisms with the public sector at the federal level, with state and local governments to find new sources of lower cost capital for affordable housing. We're going to need it even as we also work to drive down the actual development and construction costs, because there's no way we'll be able to make the kind of progress we need as quickly as we need to make it on the housing supply shortage if we don't really power through the barriers to producing housing much more quickly and less expensively than we're doing it today.
Thank you for those insights, Stockton. A lot of good things to look forward to. As we kind of wrap up, Stockton, one last question, again, just around advocacy. Obviously, groups such as NCSHA and yourself just spearheading so many big initiatives. What can our listeners do to help support those efforts?
I appreciate your involvement in NCSHA and advocacy and many of your listeners. And since just about everyone listening has probably attended one of our conferences or other industry conferences, you've heard many speakers over the years say the single most important and effective way to continue the positive momentum that we're building in both parties of Congress and at the state level on housing is to just take the elected officials to the communities that you're creating, introduce them to the residents, show them the impact on the local economy that affordable housing has. It's so simple, but it really does take a lot of work and focus. And, it has to be done over and over, even with the same members of Congress or state officials and their staff, because they got a million things they're dealing with. They have short attention spans. And so that part of our job just really never becomes done, and it always remains affordable. I also think, and I credit the Buzz House and your all's launching a podcast, which I know is now several years into existence, is a great example of how I think our field needs to do more in newer forms of media, social media, podcasts, other forms of communication that are actually going to reach not just our allies and our companions and competitors in the industry, but the broader public. The good news is there is much wider recognition among everyday people of affordable housing needs, and housing affordability is a problem. But we still have a lot to do to really educate the public and get broad public support for policies that are going to make a difference. So housing costs and voters' frustration with high housing prices, that's clearly showing up in the polls. And you see a lot of sentiment in the polling that voters on all sides want elected officials to take action. But when you start to really push further to what kind of specific action, most people will say, well, I don't know, or I'm not sure. And so that's kind of the next step in our advocacy and education effort that we all have to make. And I think newer communications and media platforms like this one would be a really effective way to do that.
Very good. Again, great insight, a lot of optimism heading into 26. That's it for this episode of The Buzz House, catching up with Stockton Williams on some of NCSHA's priorities and related legislation discussions. Once again, I'm Don Bernards.
And I'm Garrett Gibson.
Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. For additional resources around multifamily housing, check out bakertilly.com. If you have a suggestion for the show, email us at build@bakertilly.com. That's BUILD at bakertilly.com. See you next time on Buzz House.